Welcome back, everybody. We have such a treat today. It's such a privilege for me to host our next guest. Dr. Bob Melamede is here with us. Now, for most of our listeners, Dr. Bob needs no introduction. His work is very well known. But for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Bob or his work, Dr. Bob is a researcher and biologist in the field of endocannabinoids and cannabinoids. I would venture to say that he is one of the top researchers in this field. And incredibly and lovably, and admirably outspoken in his approach to education. So actually, he did a course at the University of Colorado, called, endocannabinoids and medical marijuana. And it's still being talked about to this day. So we're very fortunate to have him here with us. And for those of you who are not familiar with cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system, let me put it in a nutshell for you, only with the way that I understand it to be. The endocannabinoid system is responsible for regulating every other system in our body. So where you have your digestive system regulating your digestive tract and that process, your respiratory system regulating your breathing, and so on and so forth. The endocannabinoid system regulates all of those. Okay, so that's like your master, you can call it your motherboard, I suppose, of this wonderful mechanism we call our bodies. But so he is one of the leading researchers in that area and how cannabis and cannabinoids affect our endocannabinoid system. So we're going to bring him on board right now, and he's going to share some of his knowledge with us. I highly suggest that you also go look at some of his videos on YouTube, go read about his work. It's very exciting and very interesting, and I'll tell you, you will be so much better off for having investigated this topic because you will be better equipped to deal with your own health afterwards. Okay, so without further ado, let's bring Dr. Bob on.
Dr. Bob, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Well, wonderful. Welcome. We are so fortunate to have you. I couldn't be more excited myself.
Well, it's my privilege.
Great. Now, I'm going to get right into it here. And I'm going to ask you, first of all, how did you get into this line of research? What prompted your interest in it? And tell me what you found when you really started digging.
Well, I've had a long history. I've been, I have to say that, I'm an old hippie. So that back in the 60s, like everyone else, I started using cannabis when I was 16. It was also the same time that I started college. And for me, I've always been very ADD, and, even though I succeeded in school, I never really did well and applied myself. So what happened was, as I used more and more cannabis, it made me more introspective and personally honest. And I finally realized that if you're going to go to college, what you should do is actually go there to learn. And I kept improving until by the time I was a senior, I had become a good student. And by the time I was in graduate school, I was an excellent student. And cannabis contributed very much to that. So I always felt that it was something that, for me, led to personal improvement. And then I got my PhD, and I wound up working in an area known as DNA repair, specifically what's known as basic fission repair. It's where we have enzymes that see when our DNA gets damaged, typically by free radicals, and how we fix that so that we don't accumulate mutations that lead to cancers and autoimmune diseases, etc. So I had, a good background, and I became politically active when I moved to Vermont. We started the Vermont Grassroots Party. I ran for U.S. Senate and for U.S. Congress in 94, 96, and 98. And I had a TV show there also called the Cannabis Cable Network. It was a live call-in TV show. So all of those things, I was always involved with it. And it was back in the 90s that the science really started to emerge with the discovery that we had specific receptors for THC, and that led ultimately to the discovery that we produce our own cannabinoids, endocannabinoids as they're known. And so from there, it was just a continuation of that path. When I came out to Colorado at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, I came out as chairman. And, you have to publish or perish. You've got to accomplish something, or you don't get your tenure, and then you lose your job. And I realized that I would not be able to continue in the research vein that I had been doing for decades, just because I didn't have the right environment and infrastructure. And cannabinoids was such a natural. I was able to synthesize kind of novel ways of looking at things, because along the way in my educational past, I was always interested in what is life, and that led me to the work of Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine, who basically created a field known as far-from equilibrium thermodynamics that actually gives you a nice scientific way of understanding life and how everything really works, because it's how creativity manifests itself in living forms. And that creativity not only means evolution, but our whole social, financial, economic structures all have this scientific underpinning. So I was able to integrate physics, biology, and cannabis just at this very critical time in man's acquisition of new knowledge, meaning the explosion of science surrounding the endocannabinoid system, which we now know regulates literally everything in our body. So it's been fun.
Now, can you give our listeners a little information on the THC receptors and how cannabis interacts with them? I found that very interesting, and I know coming from you, you will put it in layman's terms to where everyone can understand this.
Well, the thing that everybody has to understand as a starting point, and this is something that comes from that far-from equilibrium thermodynamics as it's manifest in life and biology, is that everything's about communication, and that within ourselves and between ourselves and the various higher forms of organization in our bodies, the formation of tissues and organs and how they communicate, and then actually even extending to how individuals within a population communicate. Everything is about communication and this unfolding of complexity that arises because the future is always built on the past. So we just keep getting essentially more complex and more capable of interacting and manipulating and having a dialogue with our environment, which again takes us back to communication. So along the evolutionary past, one of the significant forms of communication that developed in a general sense were these cell receptors that communicate with ligands, compounds that bind to receptors, and they in turn change the biochemistry within the cells that have the receptors and are responding to the ligands, to the things that bind to those receptors. So it turns out that evolutionarily, at the point when vertebrates first evolved, that's when the cannabinoid receptors first appeared. They seem to have a evolutionary past in other forms of similar types of receptors. They're known as decoupled protein receptors. So there's a kind of an archaeological history, a biological archaeological history of where these receptors came from, and they were modified from earlier forms of mineralocorticoid receptors. But the big thing is really that when we had that division forming what's known as deuterostomes versus proteostomes, and I'll explain what that means. We all have a tube that runs through us. our digestive tract, right? So we have an anus on one end and a mouth on the other. And from an embryological point of view, if you just think about it, a sperm and egg got together, you had one cell. That cell divides and you have a ball of cells. That ball of cells eventually forms a hollow ball, and that hollow ball eventually forms the indent that becomes the tube of our digestive system as we embryologically develop. Well, that tube can start either of two ways. You can form butt first or you can form head first. And it turns out that all vertebrates, and therefore all birds and reptiles and mammals and fish, we all develop butt first. Now, we are known as deuterostomes. And in contrast, there's another set of invertebrate organisms that do not have backbones, basically spines, and they develop head first. They're called the proteostomes. And they consist of insects and crustacean are the main members of that category. Well, it turns out very fascinating and interestingly that the proteostomes, the insects, they don't have cannabinoid receptors, whereas our whole lineage does have cannabinoid receptors. And if you look, what you wind up seeing is that our lineage has a very unique immune system, bones, muscles, skeletal system. Our whole body composition is fundamentally different than that of insects and other proteostomes.